Good evening, everybody. Happy New Year. Hope you had a good Christmas break if you celebrate it. Even if you don't, I'd imagine you had some time off. So hopefully you're back and refreshed and ready to go. I must admit, like about 2 weeks in, I was like, yeah, I'm gassed out. I've done my dash for 2025. So hopefully our office hours will help me recharge the batteries. Before I get started, as always, sing out in the chat line if you can't hear me or see me. Judith has put something on the chat, which means everyone can chat, which is awesome. Without further ado, I think we'll leap straight into it. Lots of good stuff to cover tonight. But if you had anything very interesting, technology or personally related over the holiday, feel free to put it in the chat. We're all friends here. And we'll have a good fun session. Let me share my screen, move my windows around so I can see you all, and we'll get into it. There we go. Lost my mojo over the break. Okay, let's resize my window. Can I see the chat? Yes, I can. Hopefully you can see my screen and still see me and hear me on the audio. If not, sing out in the chat and I'll panic. As always, getting in touch is easy. Just scan the QR code or head over to linktree/Connor. Even though Blue Sky has become the thing for people who are anti-Twitter at the moment, I'm still on both. So you can get me on Twitter, you can get me on Blue Sky. If you're an Oracle professional, a good chunk of Oracle people, both Oracle employees and just people in the Oracle community, seem to have moved to Blue Sky. So it seems a much nicer place to have technical discussion. So I'd encourage you to check that out if you're into social media. Okay, as I always say, no need to adjust your set. Some of the content often appears skewed left, right, in the middle, etc., mainly such that we can turn this into a useful video later. As I always say, nothing irks me more than when someone's ugly head blocks the critical part of the demo or the slides or whatever, so we try avoid that. As always, to start the new year, we'll do a few bits and pieces, what's going on, what's coming up. There's a whole stack of stuff happening in February and March, which I thought I should tell you about. So the first of all, obviously, unless you've been living on another planet, you would have seen that Apex 24.2 got released, I think today or yesterday, depending on what geographical time zone you're in. Very sharp release. I was super excited because I saw it come out on apex.oracle.com and I thought, okay, it'll sit there for a while and then the download will come out later on. But no, day later, out it came for the download as well. So you can now run Apex 24.2 on your own Apex installations. I haven't yet installed it on my system here because the Ask Tom system is still running 24.1 and I want to keep those two in sync, but I'll be playing with it here shortly. Not that I'm an Apex expert, but I should say I need to finish on time because if you're an Apex person, the first of the Apex 24.2 feature office hours starts in 1 hour's time. So I better get a movement. As I said, stay on office hours. What's coming up? In February, the AIOG, led by Sai, are running their multi-cloud event. So if you're anywhere in India, so we've got Delhi, Hyderabad, Bangalore, and Pune. If you're any of those four cities, we're coming to visit you in February. Head over to that website to see what's going on. In the middle of that as well is Cloud World, which is in Mumbai. So there's plenty for everyone, wherever you are in the Indian technology centers. Speaking of Cloud Worlds, I'll have the privilege of doing a talk in Cloud World Singapore. You've probably heard of the what we call the Global Cloud World Tours. Obviously, going to Vegas is awesome, but it can be obviously inconvenient. It can be very expensive, and it's a lot of time out of people's working lives. So we try to bring Cloud World or Cloud World highlights to you. So there's a whole stack of cities. There's, I think Dubai starts, tomorrow maybe, or even early next week. You've got Dubai, Saudi Arabia, Singapore. I'll also be in Cloud World Sydney, which obviously is a lot closer to home for me. But there's all over the world. One in London, I think. So there's Cloud World sort of condensed versions coming to you such that you don't have to make such an arduous trip to Vegas. I'll be in Cloud World Mumbai, maybe. I don't have any speaking responsibilities in Cloud World Mumbai, but I hope to be out there on the exhibition floor. So if you want to come say hi or just talk tech, I'll have my laptop with me. So if you want to run through some 23 AI demos, I can certainly do that for you as well, as long as I can get in the door. Couple of things, the Ascend, or Ascend, depending on how you like to pronounce it, conference call for papers finishes in just a few days. So I thought I'd put this up there. That's gone by a number of names over the years, but this one's in, in Florida. So if you've never been to Disneyland, good way to go to Disneyland and to get to a good IT conference as well. The call for papers for Apex Alp Adria is just about done as well. And I actually submitted for this, but had to withdraw it. Unfortunately, the 11th of April is my partner's birthday. And so once I told her that I'm thinking about submitting for this conference on April 11th, I got that look that you get from one's partner. And so I had to withdraw my submissions. The call for papers for the IT, Italian Oracle User Group, finishes on February the 1st. That one's in Milan. I've been to Italian User Group conferences before. Milan is beautiful and they run a fantastic event. So I'd encourage you, if you're in Europe, to get along to that. RMUG, this year, fantastic. RMUG is free. They're running RMUG free this year. So if you're in Denver in the US, get along to the RMUG site. I presented there many, many years ago. Haven't had a chance to get back because it's a long way from Perth. But yeah, highly recommended. And yeah, you can obviously go in the mountains in Denver and do some sightseeing as well. And coming up, the good friends at Auditing asked me to put this in here because Kscope registrations have opened. So Kscope is off in June, not July like last year, so it's a little bit earlier. But yeah, obviously pretty much one of the premier Oracle Apex and development and database conferences out there. So Kscope is in Texas this year. So if you've never been to Texas, you want to see where everything's bigger, head down to Kscope. And as always, all this is really just my way of saying support your user groups. Okay, that's the key thing. Get along, even if you can't get to those major conferences, get along to your local user group events. If you're not having one, get on touch with them and say, look, let's run one. Let's do a meetup with 5 people, 10 people, 20, it doesn't matter. The more we can build and prosper our community, I think the better off we all are. Now, one thing I will say is, as I'm dedicated to the craft, I've turned my air conditioner off so it doesn't have that annoying hum. So you'll see me get more and more sweaty as the night goes on. Just ignore that. I'm not having some sort of episode. It's just very warm. It was 40 plus degrees today here in Perth. And so the house was nice and cool until about 20 minutes ago when I turned the aircon off. And I can already feel it getting slowly warmer as we continue on. What have we got to talk about tonight? As I said, we've got to finish on time because a lot of people want to head off to the very cool Apex launch stuff. Get that off asktom.oracle.com/office hours. Okay, some questions that came in. We've got adding identity columns, the concept of set and forget auditing. I'll explain what that means when we get to it. How to increase the column length in Edition Based Redefinition. A couple of 23AI questions that came in, one about SQL history, one about row change tracking. Dealing with SQL macros, a cool piece of technology that came along in Oracle 19, and partitioning, and how to validate a URL from within inside the database. What's that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7. Okay, we better get stuck into it. As always, interactive wins the game. So if you have any questions or thoughts or comments or things you want to add to it, as I said, I'm not the expert here. All of us is more than one of us. So if you have any comments, additions, please throw them in the chat line such that we can all benefit from as much as can for this 1 hour. Okay, adding an identity column. Here's the question that came in. I want to convert an existing column to an identity column. Is that possible? If not, what is the best way to add? I think add one as opposed to add on there, but you get the idea. Well, what you want, as in just grab an existing, say, surrogate key column that's populated, say, with a sequence, and just say, from now on, it's an identity column. We don't have that, unfortunately. It's an enhancement request that is logged in our database. So it's something that may come along one day, but currently, as it stands, you can't grab an existing column and say, convert it to being an identity column. If a column is already an identity column, you can change its properties to change the way it acts as an identity column. But just grabbing any old column and saying, yep, be an identity column from now on is not possible. I know you'd like to do that, and hopefully that enhancement request will come in. So let's explore some of our options and some of the pros and cons, perhaps. Okay, so first demo of the night. Oh, I've already got something in the Q&A. Okay. To set the scene, we're going to create a table, obviously without an identity column, and we'll see what we can do in terms of converting it to a table that has an identity column. So I create a table hook T. It's just a copy of DBA objects. I put where object ID is not null there, such that object ID is present for all rows. Therefore, I can put a primary key on it and see how we go. Chat line's off and ready. Apex is 2 hours later, so take my time. Oh, sensational. There we go. I'll start till finish on time. So I've added a primary key to my table called T. And this is what we'd like to do, obviously. That's a primary key. It's numeric. It's, numbers probably go from 1 to 100,000 or so. Whether it's object ID or populated with a sequence currently, this is what we'd like to do. Alter table, modify that column, make an identity column. You get a syntax error. If I do the full sort of generated as identity, I still get a syntax error as well. Notice it says column to be modified is not an identity column. And at which point you're going, well, do I know that? I want it to become one. The reason it's saying that is because, as I said before, with an identity column, you can modify an existing identity column's properties. You just can't convert a non-identity one into an identity one. So this is how we can do it. I can add a brand new column called new primary key, generate it always as identity. Now, even though this table's got 80,000 rows, you probably would have noticed the slight pause there, because the moment you add an identity column, it goes and back populates all the values. If I go query that column, you can see it actually went and back populated every single row. I've just listed the first 10 there with the values 1, 2, 3, 4 up to 80,000 or so. And now it's ready to continue its life as a identity column. That's a non-trivial exercise. Obviously, you've got a table with 1 million or 1 billion rows. That's a lot of work backfitting that data into the table. And to dig into that a little bit further, let me analyze the table and compute statistics. Now, I'm not using DBMS stats here because I want to see what the chain count is, and DBMS stats doesn't do this. And in this case, I was lucky. The default percent free of 10 for my table was enough to allow that new column with all its numeric values to be populated to still fit in the same block. I didn't have to relocate any blocks around. Now, that may be the case for your situation, but it might not be. If I take this new column and drop it, and now what I'll do is I'll move my table and set the percent free to 0. Now, I'm not saying most of your tables will be percent free 0. What I am saying is that in the normal life of a table, if it's undergoing updates, there's a very good chance that default percent free of 10%, some of that space will have been chewed up by updates over time. So there's a very good chance that some of the blocks, in this case all the blocks in your table, will not have a great deal of space left in them in order to retrofit an identity column. So in this case, I'll go do that same operation again, add a new column which is an identity, and the act of doing that ended up with, in this case, 5,500 chained rows. In this case, I simply couldn't fit all those values in there. And there's no way around it. You can't tell a database, don't backfit that identity column and put all the rows in there. There's nothing you can do about it. If I drop my table and recreate it, what if I don't do generated always? What if I say, well, just by default on null? Does that somehow avoid the retrofitting of all the values? Unfortunately not. So there's no way around it. And because this table is small, it's instantaneous. If your table has hundreds of millions of rows, that's a huge operation. And while this is going on, that table is locked because we're doing DDL on a table. That table is going to be locked. I haven't actually checked if you can do alter table generated binary as online. I'll have to take that offline, no pun intended, and we'll see how we go. But we can assume at the moment that if we run it like this, it's locking your table for as long as it takes to populate all those rows. I think I've got more in the Q&A. Oh no, it's just an existing QA. My apologies. So let's explore ways if I were to get an identity column and not pay that awkward price of having that giant table locked, plus that very, very expensive operation, plus the risk of having a lot of chained rows. Here's an option you can explore. I'll drop my table here and recreate it just with a sample of columns, just to make the number of columns small. I didn't want to basically have too many columns in my table. I'll add a primary key as before. Now, rather than just adding identity column to this table, what I'll do is I'll create a brand new table called tnew, which is just a copy of table, and you can see where 1 equals 0, so this table is empty. So the cost of adding an identity column to this table is 0. There's no rows to back populate yet. Now, that's all well and good, but if now I'm going to copy all those rows from T into T new, then that's obviously very, very expensive. And once again, my system has to be down while I do it. Or does it? If I'm copying data from one table to another table which has a similar structure, hopefully that raises a little light bulb in your head and you think, I know what I can use for that. I can use DB-Based Redefinition. So I'm going to start redefining my table T to a table T new, which has the extra identity column. And then go ahead, and normally I could do the syncs and do the constraints and all the normal stuff you do with a full DB-Based Redefinition. But in this case, I'm just basically doing finish the redefinition. And at the end of it, look what I've got. My table T now has a identity column called new primary key, and I didn't have a large outage to do it. And because under the covers, DB-Based Redefinition is copying data from one place to a brand new table, in fact, a materialized view, but same principle applies, we're not going to get any chained rows because we're inserting rows as opposed to updating rows in place. So no outage because no significant outage time, no big locks, no chain count risk, and no back population of rows, etc. That not very expensive update. So this is a very easy way of adding identity column. Yes, you are copying all the data, but you're doing it without taking an outage. Now, just while we're talking about the identity columns, I did a blog post recently that I thought I'd touch on here, given that we're on the topic of identity columns, which is out of the box. Most of the demos most of us saw when we saw identity columns come way back in 12C were like alter table, add identity column, generated always identity. And a lot of people assumed that was all you had. You've obviously just seen that we can do generated by default on null. I'm going to make a case that I think you should probably always go default on null. Because let's look at this example. Generated always is, for lack of a better term, always. What if I have a PL SQL program like this, which I want to use the insert values row into my table called T, which has an identity column? I obviously don't nominate the identity column here because that's what identity column is. It gets populated automatically for me. I get an error. You cannot do this nice shortcut in PL SQL if you have an identity column which is generated always. This is actually just syntactic sugar. The SQL engine doesn't actually understand this. The PL SQL compiler takes this insert and says, okay, expand it out the list of columns and do a normal insert. That expansion of columns includes the identity column, and therefore it says you can't nominate an identity column in an insert. That's not allowed, and you get the error. Martin's asked, does DB-Based Redefinition cause package invalidations for redefining tables? Yes, it does, because at the end of the exercise, we are effectively doing a rename, and that will cause package invalidations. So yeah, good point. But don't forget, if you're doing alter table, add a new column, then there's a good chance some elements of package invalidations will occur. Not all, but some. Where was I? So how can we get around this? This seems an unfortunate restriction that the moment I have an identity column which is generated always, I lose this nice little PL SQL element. Well, what I can do is I can modify my identity to be generated by default on null, which means if I pass in a null, then I go enact the identity sequence value. This is an example of the This is an example of the stuff I spoke about before, where you can modify the attributes of an existing identity column, but you can't change a non-one to one. So in this case, if I run it now, you can see this works fine. Yes, it's still referencing the identity column in this insert once it gets expanded out internally, but it's passing in a null value, and that's fine because it says if it is null, then go populate it with the underlying sequence. So for that reason in particular, I like using by default on null as my, no pun intended, default, as opposed to generated always. So a couple of questions to finish off that question, to finish off that topic. Number one is identity columns, if you want to add one. My question is, I ask, is it really worth it? Even if you use the shortcut with DB-Based Redefinition, you're doing a big chunk of work. Is there much benefit besides saying, oh yes, I have a column that is called an identity column, as opposed to just doing default on null sequence.next file? That came in also in 12.2, the ability to say if a column is null, even if you explicitly try force it to be null, I will go use the sequence next value. So if you've got an existing numeric column, ask yourself, is it really worth all the effort of converting that column to an identity column by adding a new one versus just doing default on null signals on neckval? Seems to me that this is just as good. It effectively enforces all the same rules. You don't get any issues with PL SQL, etc. I ask the question, is it really worth the effort? If you're creating a new table, sure. But if you want to modify an existing one, I'd be dubious. And as we said, the definition of always is, well, always. Be aware that you simply cannot make any reference in DML to that identity column, otherwise you're going to get an error. Okay, Narendra, I haven't missed your questions. I will get to them if time allows at the end. Okay. Oh. Question 2. Is Oren on the call? If Oren's on the call, he's going to be bored with this section because we've had a chat about this already. Set and forget audit. This is the question that came in. We can't afford Golden Gate, so we have been using your audit facility to automatically create triggers. Thank you for that. You can see why I picked this question. But this means regenerating them when we do DDL changes. Can we have all of our auditing fully automatic? So we can get close, I think is the best way of describing it. So what I'll do is this demo is I'll show you how my auditing facility works, just briefly, and show you what the issue is, and then we'll look at a possible solution such that you could set up an auditing infrastructure on your tables and never have to touch that code again, no matter what DDL changes you do to the table. So let's explore those things. So we've got a table here called scott.emp2. As you can see, it's just a copy of scott.emp. And this is how my existing auditing facility works. You can get to it from my GitHub repo. You simply say, I want to generate auditing support for this particular table. The P action execute is because you can also choose action of output, which simply shows you what it would do in all the code, but wouldn't actually run it. So you can do a sort of a dry run. But what it does is it creates an auditing table to sit underneath this one. It creates an auditing package and an auditing trigger, and we can have a quick look at it. So all it's done is what we would conventionally do in the past by hand, which is build triggers and underlying mechanisms to capture any changes to the data. And my audit utility has all sorts of options, whether you want to capture the old and the new or both or just one or the other. I've just gone with all the defaults here. So let's do some samples. I delete a row, I update a row and commit it. And this is how this information is stored in my auditing solution. The basic metadata, the sort of the who, what, when, etc., gets stored in a table called audit header. So it's got the table name, the DML, etc. If we look at that, you can see in this case, I did a delete. This is the module, this is the OS user, that's me, this is the PC name, etc. This is the time, all the normal stuff. And we have the table name, etc. So this is the metadata for this particular audit operation. And then for the actual table data itself, we have a table which is called emp2, but it's stored in a different schema. And it's all the columns in my original table, plus a little bit of information that lets us link back to that audit header table for the rest of the metadata. So you can see in there, I did a delete and I captured the old image, and I did an update and I captured the old image. There are options in my audit facility to choose whether you want to capture the news on update or old and new, etc., etc. In this case, it doesn't even capture inserts because an insert, the current state of the data is in the table itself. It just captures the audit header. But you have choices. But that's what it's doing. It's, as you can imagine, it is just a trigger that has been defined on your base table. The trigger looks something like this, just flicking through quickly. As it says, it's been automatically generated. We do some initialization. Every time we touch a row, we capture it. And then at the end of it, we process all those rows to stick it into my audit table. And it's all done with a package that is also generated to capture each individual row and a bit of bulk collect, etc. So it's nice and efficient. It works fairly well. Okay. Peter said, could flashback feature be used for this task? We'll come to that, Peter. We'll come to that very shortly. So the issue that the original poster has is what happens if you do some DDL on my original table? In this case, I've added a brand new column. Well, my audit table doesn't have any knowledge of that. Now, I took this into account. Tables do change over time. So in my existing audit system, you simply recall the generation of audit support. It works out the delta between the original table and the new table, and it tries to work out what commands to run. So in this case, it would run an alter table, add a column. If you dropped a column, it would leave that untouched because we want to keep the old audit data. It would just adjust the triggers and the packages accordingly to no longer reference it, etc. So it does its best guess or best attempt at trying to make sure that you can bring things up to date. But this means that every time someone does alter a table, you need to remember to do this. Because if you add a new table, then the audit routine silently continues to work, but not capturing that new column. This is the question that's been posed. How do we solve this? Now, you could do a DDL trigger on the database level, but that means then interrogating what's actually being done and then trying to work out what to do in terms of what tables to access, etc. And also, you really can't do them during a DDL. You probably have to submit a job to have done it asynchronously. There's a lot of things going on that would need to be taken care of if you want to try fully automate it and have the existing audit columns there. So in this case, I regenerate audit support, and you can see the system has gone and added the new stuff. So let me drop that. Let me propose another option. If this is really critical to you, if you're in an environment where you're doing stacks of data table changes all the time, and this is going to be a pain or not practical for you, here's a new operation. First, I'll create a sequence, and then I'll create a global audit table. This is going to audit everything in my system. It doesn't have to, but I'm doing this across the board. So it's got an audit ID, which is effectively, an identity column, an audit operation sequence. So a single sequence might consist of several entries to an audit. So we want a way of grouping them together, plus all the normal metadata you want to capture about an audit. But all my audit data is just going to be stored as a blob. Now, I'm not storing it as a binary image of some description. What I am storing it is as a JSON. Going to be a JSON representation of all my columns and values. And obviously JSON allows me for free form in my structure. It's a blob because, as we know, if you're using format OSOM, which is nice and efficient, in 21C and above, that'll just be called JSON data type. But in 19C, you can do it this way. Set it as a blob, which uses half the storage of using a club, and I've partitioned it so we can do archival, etc. So this is how we're going to tackle this system. Now, remember, we can't reference a column because that column might be dropped, etc. So any column in the table can't be referenced during the capture of audit. So I'm going to do a compound trigger. In this case, I could actually do this separately for each of the operations, but I'm doing it all as once here just for simplicity. So I need to work out what operation I'm doing here. And all I'm really interested in is the row ID of what actually I'm changing. So before statement, so before my actual DML occurs, I'm going to remember my system change number. Because if I do a delete, after my delete is finished, I've lost access to that data, obviously, it's gone. So I'm going to have to use, as been suggested here, I'm going to have to use flashback to go resurrect that data. I can't store it during the trigger here because to store it would mean referencing the columns. And I can't reference the columns because then the trigger is now dependent on the column definition. Now, I'm using a private temporary table here to have a list of every single row ID that's been altered. Now, I could just use a nested table, like just a typical table of in PL SQL. There's a bug in 19C where when it comes to the SQL I'm running later on using both row IDs and table operations, then you get ORA 600s. So I'm using a private temporary table here as a workaround for this bug. It doesn't have to be. So I'm going to create a private temporary table in this session. You can see the moment I commit, that table disappears. So I'll get to your question shortly, Marty. And to you, Hader, as well. So then after each row, what I'm doing is I'm capturing the row ID of the impacted operation. I'm actually capturing just the old row ID for delete and the new ID for insert or updating. You can make an argument that's not perhaps thorough enough. In autonomous database and some engineered systems, it is the case that an update might actually shift a row and you get a brand new row ID. So if you're doing this very rigorously, you would actually probably capture both new and old row IDs as a just in case. And I'm simply storing them in my private temporary table. And then after my statement's finished, for inserts and updates, well, I'm simply going to insert into my global table. I can do JSON object star. Therefore, I don't have any references to the columns. It's going to consolidate all the columns into a JSON fragment and store it into my audit table. And this obviously is now immune to column changes over time in my table. Now for a delete, that data's gone. I can't query the data that's no longer there. So what I'm doing is the exact same insert, but now I'm getting my table as it was when this transaction started. Now we'll come back to some of the implications of that shortly. So let's do a test. I delete a row, I update a row, and if I go look at my audit table, you can see it's got the audit metadata, but it's now captured JSON for all the representative data. And there's no references to a single column in my triggers, so it's now immune to those DDL changes. So if I drop a column, drop another column, etc., rename a column, etc., my DML still works fine, and my audit still works as well. The new column start date is in there instead of hire date, and columns will be got dropped, etc. So there is an audit facility which is immune to column and table changes. Let's go back to the slides and we'll answer some questions. So one of the questions is, couldn't I use Flashback Data Archive for this? And the answer is yes. You could use this. Now, one of the things that you need to be very careful of is with Flashback Data Archive, it is in some ways similar to my audit facility in the sense that most DDL changes to the base table are supported, but not all. There are certain things that you are not allowed to do if you have a table that is linked to a Flashback Data Archive. So if you checked out what you consider the most typical DDLs to occur to your table over its life, and you think, yeah, that certainly falls within the realms of Flashback Data Archive. Why do I keep... Who put FDA in the chat? It's not FDA anymore. It's Flashback Time Travel. That's what it's called. But yeah, FDA, FTT, whatever. If you're using a Flashback Time Travel archive, then yes, most DDLs support it, but not all. There are certain things you do that will simply won't work. So you need to be careful that you need to read the docs carefully. That's why if you're really worried about DDL, then you would have to go for a solution like I've had, for example. Marty's asked, can you turn audit off for sort and process in SQL? Yes, if you check my audit facility, it has a concept called trigger controlling, which is for given operations, for given users, you can nominate whether the audit trigger should fire or not. You can simply take that concept and mold it into this one trivially. Head over to my GitHub repo. You can choose what rows, what users, what programs, etc. You can choose a set of rules, and you can also choose for a given, say, a maintenance operation, whether the trigger should fire or not, for example, without needing to disable it. So yeah, that's to answer that question. And one thing that's worth noting here is because I'm using a flashback query to go get the original state of the rows, consider the case where I do, for example, a delete, and then, an update, then another update, then another update, then another update. I'll capture each individual one of those changes. But if I did then a delete, for example, as part of that one transaction, well, that transaction started at an SCN some time ago. So when I go get the original values, it doesn't represent the in-flight transaction changes that have occurred. And Flashback Data Archive is the same. When you capture things in Flashback Data Archive, you're always getting the end state of a row at the conclusion of a transaction. You're not getting all the changes in between. If you want to capture every single delta simply because they were issued by people, even though they might be all in the same transaction, then really only a trigger is going to catch that. Whether you want that or not is up for debate. Okay, how are we going for time? Badly. Okay, someone said, can we have examples of this presentation after the presentation? Yeah, I try to put all my scripts up on my GitHub. Under miscellaneous scripts, there's a folder called Office Hours. It's a little bit out of date, but yeah, you'll see all the scripts we run here with the same names go into my GitHub repo, which you can get by scanning the QR code at the start of the presentation. Let me tick that one off. Increasing the column length. Here's the question that came in. We need to increase the length of a varchar2 column in a table. We are using EBR, but when we modify the length, we get invalid objects in the original edition. I thought EBR should only impact the new edition. And by and large, that is obviously the aim of EBR. You do changes such that you have absolutely zero impact on your running application in the original edition. But I want to stress, and this is a misconception that some people often have, if you have a set of scripts that you normally run, DDL, etc., and then you convert to EBR, it's not just a case of you enable additions for a schema and then you just grab those same scripts and run them. It's not a case of you just run the same code and EBR looks after it. You need to take a different approach to the way you make changes to your schema in order to protect a schema from changes for a running application. So let's do a little example of that on how to increase the length of a column, a varchar2 column, using EBR. So Here's the original problem. I'm going to create a user called demo, give them some privileges, etc. And let's build a very simple application in the demo schema. I've got a table. I've got a view which is select from that table. I modify the table to make a column larger. It's gone from 50 to 100 and the view is invalid. So if I'm not using any kind of additions, etc., this is the issue that everyone faces. You do let's try that again. You do DDL and things affected by that DDL may become invalid. Sometimes they're not. If you add a column to a table, generally subordinate objects like the views here would not become invalid. However, obviously modifying an existing column is going to have implications. So if I'm unhappy with this, I might say, okay, I'm going to jump on the EBR bandwagon to see if I can solve this. So let's drop those objects and let's create the ability for demo to use additions and create an addition called version 2 and let demo use it. So now demo can use the existing Oracle base edition, the base edition that everyone gets out of the box, but it can also now use a new edition called version 2. So I go into my base edition, create my table as I did before. This is what I would normally do when setting up EBR. I would typically rename my table to some new name because I want to create an additioning view which has the name of the original table, such that all my code that thought it was referencing a table is now referencing the additioning view. So there's my additioning view called T. It's simply select star from my now hidden or renamed table. Hopefully no one knows that there'll be an underscore T in there, and therefore they're only ever going to reference this thing called T, thinking that it's the table. And here's my application. It's hardly profound, but it's simply doing a select from my table, in fact the additioning view, and putting the row out there. So if we have a quick look at the user objects all additions view, which lists the objects in all the additions, we can see that effectively currently I've got my procedure, my view, my table obviously, and the additioning view, and everything's fine. Go into my new addition, and I'll actualize my additioning view and my procedure so I can see them here, and I can see that in both versions of my application now, Aura Base and in version 2, all my objects are valid. Now let's go and do what our original poster said. The original question came in and said, I want to go make an existing column longer. I do modify table T, make the Y column, change it from 50 to 100, and this is the disappointing result. All my stuff has become invalid, not just in version 2, but obviously in my base version as well. Now we will all probably recompile fine. Invalidations aren't a catastrophe, but the whole generally sort of mindset behind additions is that the base edition or the previous working edition is sacred. Nothing should touch it. So how do we avoid this? Well, as I said, you can't just run your original scripts that you would normally do and just blast them into EBR and hope that everything's going to work fine. Chat's come out. Okay, more questions. These are all questions I think are going to be coming for next office hours because I don't think we're going to get time to them tonight. Now, as I said, I can resolve these by compiling my views and dropping back into the base edition and compiling my views and procedures as well. Invalidations aren't a showstopper, but they are something that you need to be wary of. If this table was used by 10,000 packages, then that could be a big resource storm in solving that invalidation issue. So everything's back to valid now. The question is, how do I avoid this? Well, the way it works is, remember, we generally do everything in the new edition, and we don't want to touch the column that is currently in the base edition. So what I would do is I would actually add a new column with the larger size. Now I've made it 120 because we've now already gone from 50 to 100. So I'm going to add a brand new column, which is going to be the next target size for this column called Y. If I look, nothing's changed. Everything is fine in both editions because the addition of the new column has not impacted anything. So my application is still running fine in the Aura Base edition. It's unconcerned. I create a new additioning view in Edition V2, which is select X and new Y, which will become the Y column from T. Now, I need to obviously populate that new column with the old values. Now, I'm just doing a straight update here. Be aware that normally you would use DBMS utility to do this, and there's some other things around it in terms of outages and uptime. I'm just cheating here to make it nice and fast. You would have the cross addition triggers to keep these two things in sync, etc. Let's assume we've done all that. If we have a look, the only thing now that has become invalid is the procedure in the new edition, which is what we want. Nothing in the old edition has been impacted. I compile that, and as we can see, I can now happily insert a 120 character value into my column called Y in the new edition. And executing my procedure works fine as well. So that's how you do it. It seems extreme, I know, that to simply modify the length of a column, you actually have to add a new column. But that's what EBR is. EBR is all about not touching existing values in order to preserve the active running state of an application. Let's go back to my slides. Now, I want to stress, this is not me saying that every time you want to add a column, let me start again. This is not me saying every time you want to change the precision of a column that you must add a brand new one in EBR. It's a cost-benefit decision. As I said, invalidations aren't a big drama in an Oracle database. It's only if you've got sways of them, or you've got packages or procedures that are very frequently used. If they're constantly being run, then sometimes an invalidation might cause some pinning issues because everyone's now trying to use and recompile that package at the same time. So there are issues that you need to be cautious of. But often in a quiet time, it would be fine to simply change the original column, right? If you're just extending it to make these changes. So it's a cost-benefit decision. But if you want to really sort of obey that concept of EBR where you don't touch the existing columns, in order to make changes, then that's the way to do it. Now, a quick segue on EBR, just to finish off this topic, is I want to stress that one of the reasons a lot of people don't adopt EBR is in the past, the sort of the mindset from coming out of Oracle Corporation has been that EBR is, I've said it's a Boolean thing. It's true or it's false. You're either not using EBR, but if you do, you have to go the whole hog. Cross-edition triggers, editioning views, very careful usage, actualization everywhere, and you will never, ever have an outage ever again. That's the purest model. Now, that's great. If you do that, that's awesome. But it doesn't mean that's the only way you have to use EBR. And I want to stress that EBR is far more useful, not for this utopian goal of zero outage. I know lots of customers that have a principle of where if they're changing code, if they're changing triggers, PL SQL, etc., they'll use additions for that. But if they're changing the underlying structure of the tables, then they'll take an outage. It's a cost benefit for them. Because if you don't want to take an outage for that, then yes, it's more complicated. But just rolling out code changes, why wouldn't you create a new edition so you can roll those changes out, test them in isolation, prove them on your production environment before letting them, unleashing them to the whole world? Using EBR for just that might be useful. What if, for example, I want to do some changes to a table and there's a trigger on that table that would normally fire? I don't want to disable that trigger because that disables it for everyone. I could create a new edition, basically put a different trigger or no trigger in that new edition and do my maintenance there. There's all sorts of ways where EBR can benefit you, not just about 100% outages. So have a look at EBR. You might be surprised at the number of very useful facilities you can get out of it without being focused on eliminating outages. Hideo said, what is the relation between EBR and application containers? There is no relation. They are separate technologies. You can use one with the other or them in isolation. Application containers is more targeted typically at having multiple copies of the single application or single database schema or data within it to make available typically to, for example, different customers, different groups, etc. You could run EBR inside each container if you wanted to avoid outages. They're more sort of different use cases. Application containers is more about effectively a consolidated version of a database schema that you want to make available to multiple groups of people with data isolation. That makes sense, hopefully. How are we going? 9:45. We'll get through some of them. Okay. 23AI. Let's get us some latest and greatest technology. SQL history. Here's the question that came in. The docs say that SQL history in 23AI can be enabled at session level, but it's not working. Is this a bug? Well, no and yes. I'm not sure where we sit on this, but I'll show you what the issue is. Officially, it's not a bug. It's the way we've actually implemented the facility, but we may change it based on your feedback. Fundamentally, this is about allowing DBAs to have some control over the feature. So let's have a look at this. Now, if you've never seen the SQL history feature, you'll be impressed with this one as well. Inside 23AI, there's a new view called $V SQL history. And as the name suggests, if you've ever used like SQL Developer or any of these tools which keep a list of all the SQLs you've run in your client tool, we can do the same thing now on the database. And you can see we're capturing a lot of stuff about it. You know, the SQL ID, but also all these bits and pieces about the stats, etc., and who ran it, etc. All sorts of good stuff captured in this $V SQL history view. So if I select from $V history by default, it's empty. And as the docs say, it is a session enableable parameter. So let's turn it on at session level. Alter session set SQL history enable equals true. I'll run a few queries. And the cool thing is when I look at my $V SQL history table, there's nothing. Is this a bug? Officially, no. Let me explain what we've done with SQL history here. SQL history needs to be turned on at the instance level by a DBA. So we're giving a DBA access to control this facility system-wide. Once that's been done, I'll just bounce my pluggable database to activate it. So by default now, everyone's SQL history is now turned on, but a DBA needed to do this first. My assumption is, I don't know if this is truly the case, but my guess is we need this to allocate some memory structures in the SGA such that people can actually access it. Now when I connect to any brand new session, I run a few queries and voila, my SQL history view is populated. You can see the two queries I ran. You might be wondering, where did these come from? Well, this one was run by SQL Plus every time you do a brand new connection. And these were run by me in my login.sql file, which gets run every time you reconnect in SQL Plus. So literally the moment you start that session, every SQL you run is going to be captured in SQL history. Now that it's enabled at system level, one of the things I can do at session level, and this is why we say it is a session enableable parameter, is you can turn it off. So at session level, you can also choose whether it's on or off. I might turn it off such that if I run a query like this, I'd rather not have that captured in SQL history, just counting my porno subscription. And if I query SQL history, it's gone. All my history is gone. Now, one of the cool things is this is simply looking at this flag to see if your SQL history is enabled. So if I turn my SQL history back on again, it doesn't start from scratch. My SQL history is there. It just never caught the somewhat dubious SQL I'd rather not have captured. So they're all still there while I'm still in this session. And this is a session facility. This is the really nice thing about it. You're not going to have issues here where I'm going to see other people's SQL history, etc., in case there's sensitive data in there. If I run two more queries, the nice thing is, see, it doesn't just repeat them. It actually stores them as individual executions of the queries. This is some cool stuff. As I said, there's only one session ID in this SQL history that's my session. Each SQL history view is unique to this particular session. You can only see your own queries, so there's no security risk there. And the other really cool thing is, it's not just about queries that work. If I do select count star from my non-existent table, even that is captured in here. And one of the nice things in SQL history is we also catch the error code. In this case, error code 942, table of view does not exist. So it's not just things that work, it's every SQL statement you launched at the database in this session is captured if you've turned SQL history on, but you can turn it off at session level as well. This is going around internally in terms of discussion because, as you'd imagine, the vast majority of parameters along these lines, true or false things that you can turn on in the database, don't work this way. Typically what happens is if we say you can activate it at session level, then you can activate it at session level, not relying on some system level setting. So we're having another look at this. I'm not saying this is what's going to happen, but for me, this would be the ideal situation. I would like the system level parameter to have off, which means no one can use it. A DBA can simply say, I'm not having it on, it's being turned off altogether. Permitted, which means it would be off by default, but people could turn it on at session level. On, which means it would be on by default, but people could turn it off at session level. And force, which would be the DBA turns it on and it's on at session level no matter what someone tries to do. The reason I chose those words is they're the same when you use for the parameter secure file, we use whether secure files are permitted, always, on, false, etc. So I try to be consistent. That would be my ideal situation. But at the moment, just be aware that as it stands, it needs to be turned on at system level, and then you can control it individually for your own session. Okay, I'll answer the ones which are relevant to our session. Okay, is SQL session usage parameter set false by default? Yes, it is. Out of a stock standard 23 AI, it defaults to false, so it won't be on by default. Is SQL history going to all SQLs, including recursive SQLs? I don't think it captures recursive SQLs. I think by default, it's designed to be SQLs that you have launched in your session. So I'm pretty sure they're just the top level SQLs that are caught. I will confirm that, but I don't think recursive SQLs are caught. You need to use SQL Trace for that. Can you re-execute some SQL history without having to type it again? No, I don't think so. It's not like the client tools like Toad, SQL Developer, SQL CL, where they're sitting there and you can go retrieve it. I don't think that is the case. I'd imagine you could simply cut and paste it, but I don't think you can actually go. I don't think the tools currently support going and looking at all the SQL history and grabbing it out of there. That's a nice idea, though. I like that idea. I'll pass that along. Pitt said, did I just mention the T tool, the Toad tool? Yes, that's right. Hey, if you want to pay thousands of dollars every year for every single person that simply wants to talk to the database, when you could do it for free with plenty of other tools, all of which are supported by us, hey, knock yourself out. I don't mind if you want to spend stupid money on stupid things. That's not my place to tell you. Anyway, so good point, Pierre. What do we got left? What do we got? 9:52. Oh, we reckon we can get this one done. 23 AI row change tracking. This is something that someone noticed in one of the 23 AI forums. They said user tables in 23 AI has a new column called row change tracking, but there's nothing in the documentation about it. What is the column for? Now, I want to stress, have to put the safe harbor warning up here. The reason it's in the data dictionary, but there's nothing in the docs about it, is this is a feature that is undergoing, at the moment, development inside 23 AI. So it may come in a later RU, 23.7, 23.8, etc., but it may never exist. It's under development. So we'll decide, we obviously need to code it up, test it, make sure it doesn't break anything, make sure there's no security issues, all the normal stuff we do when we build a new feature. So at the moment, some of the information is there. Now, I've got a pre-release version of 23 here. So the next version or the next couple of versions are coming out. So it is in there, but there's no guarantees that this facility will ever come to fruition. But I'll show you what the intent is of it. Since back in Oracle 8, 8i, I think, you've been able to do online operations. In this case, for example, create an index on a table online, which means while I'm building the index, changes might be occurring. People might be inserting rows in the table, deleting rows in the table, etc. And most people know that the way we do these online operations is we do it for the data we can see. And while that operation is running, we keep track of what's happening on the base table. And at the end of it, we take a small lock and then we can replay those transactions such that we can sort of resync things. So somewhere internally, when you're doing these online operations, we're keeping track of row changes in the database, so we can apply them at the end of the operation. And wouldn't it be cool if that facility was exposed to you for your own usages? And that's what we've got here. So let me create a table called T1 here. It's just a copy of DBA objects. And I'm going to do alter table enable row change tracking. This works because this is a pre-release of the database. If I do an insert and do an update, for example, and do a delete, first of all, I need to remember the SCN number, because I need to know when this transaction happened. And you can see that this is obviously a work in progress, because there's all these, you're passing the SN, there's these random flags, etc. This would be the kind of things that would be obviously cleaned up in terms of a fully productionized release. But what it does is, it said, okay, since that SCN occurred, these are some ranges of row IDs. So starting and ending row ID ranges in which some changes have occurred. We have been tracking those DMLs that have occurred because we did alter table enable row tracking. Given those row ranges, there's other things going on behind the scenes, which says we can actually go get the row IDs for those particular inside those row ID ranges. So first we establish the ranges that have been changed, and then within those ranges we can actually get the actual row IDs. This row ID was updated, this one was deleted, and this one was inserted. So you could go do something with this if you wanted to. You could now go use this information in some way. Once you've done whatever you might be using this for change data tracking or doing some sort of auditing, for example, or anything that you want to do with those rows that have been changed, you can then say, I want to consume them, which means effectively you're moving the line. I'm finished with those changes, please start afresh. So at that point, I've finished. I'm effectively starting row change tracking again from this point in time. So now if I go, look, there's no more rows to be processed. I've told the database I'm done with all the changes that have been occurred up to now. If some more operations occur, then I get the SCN again, and you can see there's a fresh set of row changes captured. So it's this online, moving goalpost of changes that are occurring, and each time you let the database know, yep, I'm finished with these, let's move on. So that's row change tracking in a nutshell. Remember, this feature may never come to existence. It's in a pre-release, and if it is, it won't look like that. It'll maybe have some changes associated with it, but I like the idea of exposing this internal facility, which we've had forever since Oracle 8i, to APIs that might be useful for you, because there might be all sorts of innovative uses that you might have for them. Chat. Okay, Marty's. Can we get an example of turning off audit for certain tables, SQL procedures? We have an issue with vendor code not working properly. Well, as I said, if you head over to my GitHub repo, Marty, you can see that. Or you can ping me on a DM on Twitter and I'll show an example. But be aware, that's facilities for my particular audit utility, which I'm sure you could factor into your own solutions. But if it's vendor code, they might not let you touching that information. On that note, it is 9:58. There's a few questions we could have covered, but I think we'll have to call it quits there so we finish on time. Let me stop the share. As always, thank you very much for your time. For those questions that came in the QA which were unrelated to today's session, I will effectively go and turn them into questions for maybe next office hours session, or contact you offline, or turn them into blog posts in some way, shape or form. I'll hopefully get to them. One last question for Jeff here. Does it include binds? Was that referring to the row change tracking? Or was that SQL history? One of the two. Anyway, Jeff works at Oracle. He's not going to stay on the call any longer because he's going off to the Apex 24 launch. That's for sure. I'll double check for you and get back to Jeff offline in terms of I'll talk to you internally on that one. But as always, thank you very much for giving up your time. I love doing these, as you can hopefully imagine. Hopefully I'm not too sweaty. And obviously we'll have more to cover in February's office hours. But if you're in Mumbai, Singapore, Delhi, Pune, Bangalore, Sydney, etc., please come say hi. I'll have my laptop in hand. We can do some 23 AI stuff and have some fun. But if I don't see you at one of these conferences, I'll see you next month on office hours. And until then, keep working healthy with Oracle, and we'll see you all soon. Bye for now, everybody.